In your book, you argue that it is easier to change a president than to revolutionize the deeper social structures, and that in 2011, with the removal of Mubarak, there was no real full regime change. Now, has Egypt seen any significant transition to civil society since then?
I think one of the problems is that the way political science likes to have its stuff written is very outcome-based. So, something happens, an event happens, and they want you to label it, like, was this a revolution or not? And my book is very much written out of that sort of political science vein. But I think that, what we watched beginning in January of 2011 was the unleashing of a process that was historically grounded, that is pushing for deeper rights, both economically, politically, and socially, and trying to push the elites that govern the state, as well as the state structures themselves, to kind of govern more inclusively and less repressively. And with the removal of Mubarak, essentially the army stepped in and used the popular mobilization to eliminate its competitors. So it dumped Mubarak. It allowed for the ruling party headquarters to be burned to the ground. The crony capitalists that were connected to the military were allowed to continue operating. I don't think that we've seen a real big march to democratization. I like to think of it more as sort of a process that's unfolding between people that are wanting more revolutionary gains and those that want to reassert the status quo or regressively change the status quo. So it's really a battle between that, and whether it ends up in some sort of democracy or not, we don't know. There's going to be gains and there's going to be losses for those pushing for greater freedoms. These groups, historically and outside of Egypt, in the U.S., in South Africa, has always moved quite slowly for people that are pushing for change.
One of the main arguments that you make in the book is that Egypt has a centralized political control system, and this makes the regime more adaptable to popular uprising. Could you explain that?
What it means is that the system that Hosni Mubarak oversaw was quite expansive. It was wide. It had many different constituencies. So, of course, it included the former president and his sort of political team, multiple intelligence agencies, the Interior Ministry, of course, the army. It included his son's economic team. And so, it had the big, wide ruling party, which, we used to say that the ruling party was 3 lies and 3 words. But what that ruling party did is it had expansive coverage of the country that helped distribute goods and services, participate in elections. And so, why it worked the way it did is because Mubarak could do consensual politics with the top people in the country, and then the parts of the machine would work in concert. They would work together. And so he had a lot of centralized control. But it wasn't that he was sort of a dictator, like just sending out his own edicts. He really much worked consensually with the political establishment. And I think that one of the arguments of the book is that, here you have this president who had amassed an enormous amount of power, who had been in the presidency for a long time, and yet, you get this sustained, serious challenge from the population, and the military can just move in, and the most preferable option is just to dump it. And I think that was the reason they could do that is because the regime was a strong state, and it was working together for a common cause.
In the book, you say that history shows that more likely than not, authoritarianism, not democracy, emerges from moments of political transition.
Democracy is a relatively new concept. It's only really been around for 200 or 300 years. And even then, the meaning of democracy has changed quite a bit. I mean, if you go look at sort of the history of Britain, when they would do electoral reform or when they would do sort of election reform about who would get the vote, looked. It was quite modest when they would make these reforms throughout the centuries. Of course, the United States, the same applies. African Americans didn't have full voting rights until 1965. So the idea that democracy is some sort of anything other than a deep historical process where people are engaged in sort of struggling for rights, I think that bears out over time. And the idea that a popular mobilization in Egypt in 2011 can produce instant democracy is a bit difficult to take because there are historical antecedents here that are very much conditioning what's possible or not. Which is not to say that Egyptians aren't ready for democracy. Of course they're ready for democracy, but as we've seen in Egypt, while the revolution was enormously popular in 2011 and early 2011, it didn't take long for the people that had access to controlling the state apparatus and the state apparatus itself to kind of strike back and roll back some of those gains that were made or the promises that the revolution inspired. And so I anticipate that we're going to see more autocratic governance in the near term. But the funny thing about a process is that over the past 3 years in Egypt, what we've watched is the continued mobilization kind of grow, not in terms of numbers on the ground, but its effects grow. So the effects are actually greater than the sort of numbers tell right now. And that's because, they've whittled away the sort of old Mubarak state, the ruling party and these sorts of things. They've gotten rid of the idea of hereditary succession is no longer on the table. And that was so much a part of, Egypt in the 2000s. And now, the military has really ascended and taken the sort of apex position on top. And it doesn't have the same kind of regime outreach that the Mubarak regime had. And so they're very much a process of building a new regime. This is regime in formation. And I think this helps explain why we've seen so much violence since the 3rd of July of 2013. It's because it's a fairly insecure regime. And they really need to kind of buttress this with building the constituencies and building the sort of parts of a political system and the practices of a political system. So, in all intents purposes, since the 3rd of July, and I know this is probably controversial in some circles in Egypt, indicate that this is not democracy. This is some sort of military junta.
Speaking of the Egyptian military, we all know that it played a major role in the 2011 uprising, and you suggest that this return of the military brought them back into the former governing glory, that under Mubarak, you suggest, again, that he had privileged the internal security instead. So what is to be expected now in terms of what role will the military play in the coming months and year, especially if El-Sisi is elected president?
This is where I think the story is going to turn a little bit. It's going to get a little bit confusing because we're going to see the return of many of the people that helped support Mubarak's government and Mubarak's regime. So you're going to see them in the media, you're going to see them in the newspapers, you're going to see them, maybe return and establish parties, you're going to see them run for parliament. And I think the great mistake is going to be that this is somehow the return of the Mubarak state. I just don't believe that's it. Regime change has finally happened in Egypt. The military moved in, it carved up the old Mubarak ruling coalition, it dumped these various constituent parts like the ruling party, the crony capitalists it didn't control, it's going after journalist networks it doesn't control, it's going after academics it doesn't control, including at AUC. And so I think that what we're watching the regime change is not a return to the Mubarak state as much as it is the military using the continuity of many of the institutions and many of the people that are willing to support the military's mission and political power. But it's also leading to a conversion of the old state, of the Mubarak state, into one that serves the economic and political converting it over. So, for instance, as we mentioned with the Mubarak regime, you had many different constituent parts, and they all sort of work together. Now the military is moving in, and it's taking different parts of the state, and it's converting it over to ones that will serve their utility. And so that's why one reason why we're seeing a lot of the violence, and this is another reason why at the end of this process, we're going to have a completely different state than the kind that Mubarak ran. But, keeping an open mind that this is a process, right? And anytime you employ increases of state violence against the citizenry, there's opportunities for mistakes. There's opportunities for economic shocks. There's opportunities for political assassinations. So this is by no means a done deal that the military is going to be able to reform the state, but I think that their intention is to go ahead and try to do this. And they're in the process, they're going to produce a different kind of state than the kind that existed under Mubarak. I think it's going to be much more regressive and much more narrow than the Mubarak regime.
You examine essentially the variants of autocratic rule, not only in Egypt but also in Syria, so as to understand how executive power in these two countries are structured and operate. For Syria, you suggest it's a decentralized executive authority and an efficient ruling coalition, a combination that renders its regime highly adaptable to dissent and opposition. Since you wrote the book, would you argue the same thing?
In Egypt would be the case that they're the centralized executive authority with the efficient ruling coalition, and that's what allows them to adapt. In Syria, they have decentralized executive order and an inefficient ruling coalition. So what that means is that the ruling coalition and the constituent parts of the Ba'athist regime in Syria, they don't coordinate real well, they don't communicate real well, and they don't necessarily implement order very well. So, for instance, the president could think one way about an issue. The Ba'ath Party, which has its own base of power and has, an enormous amount of followers and was always a much deeper ruling party than the National Democratic Party in Egypt, may have its own ideas on a political issue. The military might have its own idea. The intelligence services, which they're, multiple replicable sort of organizations in Syria, will have their own ideas. And so what ends up happening is you get a lot of governance gridlock in Syria because it's not always clear who's blocking an initiative. And so some of the examples I used in the book were, the UN vote on Resolution 1441, which was going to legitimate the U.S. presence in Iraq, and basically how that story unfolded. And so the difference between Egypt and Syria is that in a centralized executive order like in Egypt, you can dump the president and change the executive and the system can move on. But in a decentralized executive order, even though the opposition can't beat you, you can't just displace the president because the president becomes a linchpin to the system, and if you pull him out, those already shaky foundations that the regime lies on could collapse. And so this is one reason why, even though they sort of block one another and obstruct one another in sort of normal times, whenever regime survival is in question, what they do is they double down on themselves and fight their way out together. And that's a sort of key difference between Egypt and Syria. But, it's not that I believe that executive order in Egypt has held up very well over the past 3 years. They have progressively worn it out. The military and its constitutional declarations really hampered an elected president's ability to govern. Really, the SCAF has become the executive in Egypt. And I think the reason why there's so much violence right now is because we've watched the state actually weaken in Egypt. And of course, in Syria, the state is weakened to the point it's highly unlikely Bashar al-Assad will ever control the territory we know as Syria completely again.
We've just seen the recent Geneva talks on Syria. Could one have expected any concrete results to come out of that?
Maybe, but yeah, it doesn't look like Bashar al-Assad does not appear to be going anywhere, and that's their sort of line coming from the Syrian government, and there's not a viable replacement at this stage, or there's not a viable replacement that people can sell that will look stable. But unfortunately, the conflict in Syria is not really about Syria. It's about all the other sort of regional and international powers who are trying to dictate, guide, and control the change that would happen in Syria with the Ba'athist regime and Bashar al-Assad go away. So it's a really messy situation. But Bashar al-Assad, I think it's pretty clear he's not going anywhere.